Elias Kane opened his eyes to darkness. Not the familiar absence of light from a starless night, but a suffocating, all-encompassing void. The air was heavy, like he'd woken up in the belly of a massive beast, thick with the tang of metal and ozone. His head throbbed, a dull ache radiating outward as he fought to gather his bearings. The last thing he remembered was running along the Missouri River Trail, the sharp crunch of gravel under his boots, and then the blinding light that had swallowed the world whole. Now he was here, wherever here was. A low hum vibrated through the floor beneath him, a rhythmic pulse that felt disturbingly alive. His fingertips brushed the ground, smooth, cold, unnervingly slick, not natural, not human. "Welcome back to the land of the living," a grating voice crackled, breaking the silence like glass underfoot. Kane squinted as a dim green glow illuminated the space, revealing a tall, gangly figure with tentacle-like appendages hanging from its lower face. Bioluminescent spots dotted its translucent skin, pulsing faintly as it leaned closer. The alien's voice, a guttural mix of burbles and clicks, was made intelligible by a flickering translator embedded in the wall. Kane sat up slowly, muscles groaning in protest. "Not sure I'd call this living," he muttered, his voice hoarse. The alien's spots flashed brighter, a sign of irritation, perhaps. "You will address me with respect, human. You are aboard the Zephyrites prison ship, and your pathetic life is now property of the Zephyrites." Kane raised an eyebrow, suppressing a grimace as his hand brushed against a welt on his temple. "Well, that's just fantastic. Do I get a gift basket, or is that extra?" The alien recoiled slightly, its tentacles quivering. The translator hesitated before spitting out the response. "Sarcasm will not help you here." Kane's lips curved into a lopsided grin. "No, but it's helping me." Before the alien could respond, the door behind it slid open with a hiss. Two more Zephyrites entered, their movements eerily fluid, like jellyfish gliding through water. Without a word, they hauled Kane to his feet, their slimy grip sending a shiver up his spine. "Hey, I can walk," he protested, but they ignored him, dragging him out into a corridor that stretched endlessly in both directions. The walls pulsated faintly with bioluminescent streaks, casting shifting shadows that made the space feel alive. A faint chemical tang burned his nostrils, mingling with a sharper, acrid scent that reminded him of scorched electronics. The ship groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from its very core. Kane's stomach churned as he was forced down a winding path, past cells filled with strange, grotesque shapes pressed against energy barriers. A pair of reptilian eyes tracked him from one cell, their owner's forked tongue flicking out to taste the air. In another, a mass of writhing tendrils quivered as he passed, emitting a low, mournful hum. Kane tried to steady his breathing. "You're not dead. Yet. Figure this out. One step at a time." They stopped in front of a larger cell, its entrance marked with intricate patterns that glowed faintly blue. The lead Zephyrite input a sequence on the control panel, and the energy barrier dissolved with a sound like cracking ice. "Your new home," the alien burbled with a note of satisfaction. Before Kane could offer a retort, they shoved him forward. He stumbled, catching himself just before hitting the ground. The barrier reformed behind him with a resonating hum, sealing him in. Kane turned, ready to shout something snarky, but the words died in his throat. The cell was massive, cavernous even, with walls that curved upward into shadow. But it wasn't the size that stole his breath. 3 figures loomed in the dim light, their forms casting monstrous silhouettes against the bioluminescent walls. The first was a hulking beast, its body encased in crystalline armor that shimmered with iridescent hues. Fractals of light danced across its scales with every shift, and its eyes, cold, calculating, narrowed as they locked onto him. Beside it stood a lithe, serpentine figure, its body coiled in fluid, sinuous loops. Shadows clung to its scales, rippling like liquid obsidian, and its movements were so smooth they seemed almost hypnotic. The third figure was a more traditional dragon, if anything about this situation could be called traditional. Its wings, tattered and scarred, flared slightly as it stepped forward, revealing a muscular frame marred with the marks of countless battles. Its amber eyes burned with barely restrained fury. Kane let out a low whistle, his hands instinctively raised in mock surrender. "Well, this is cozy. Do I get a bunk, or are we sharing?" The crystalline dragon, Dralvir, as he would later learn, growled, a deep resonant sound that made Kane's chest vibrate. "What is this creature?" "Looks human," the serpentine one hissed, its voice like wind through cracked glass. "Smells weak." Kane's smile tightened. "Gee, thanks. Real warm welcome." The fire dragon Harkon snorted, a puff of smoke escaping its nostrils. "If it's human, it's bait. The Zephyrites wouldn't waste a cell like this on a weakling without purpose." Kane took a cautious step back, his gaze darting between the three. "Look, I don't know what they told you, but I'm not exactly thrilled about this arrangement either. I was just out for a run, and now I'm here, so maybe let's start with names before the death glares." The serpentine dragon Zyrax coiled closer, its forked tongue flicking out as if tasting his words. "You speak boldly for someone so small." "I've been told I'm scrappy," Kane shot back, meeting its gaze with forced confidence. His pulse pounded in his ears, but he refused to show fear. "Enough," Dralvir rumbled, his crystalline scales catching the faint light. "The Zephyrites want something. They always do. And if they've put you in here with us, it means you're part of their plan." "Well," Kane said, rubbing the back of his neck, "if their plan involves me dying quietly, they're going to be disappointed." Harkon let out a low chuckle, a sound like rolling thunder. "We'll see how long you last, human." The cell fell silent, the dragons watching him with a mix of curiosity and disdain. Kane resisted the urge to pace, forcing himself to stay still under their scrutinizing gazes. The hum of the prison ship felt louder now, as though the entire structure was alive and listening. "Stay sharp," he told himself. "They think you're weak. Use that." Finally, Zyrax broke the silence, slithering back into the shadows. "We'll see if your tongue is as sharp as your wits, human." Kane exhaled slowly, his mind already racing. He didn't know why the Zephyrites had thrown him into this cell, but one thing was clear. He'd have to prove himself fast, or he wouldn't live long enough to find out. Elias Kane leaned against the cell wall, its surface pulsing faintly under his touch like the skin of some massive, slumbering creature. The dragons had retreated to their corners, their forms shifting uneasily in the dim, bioluminescent glow. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional hum of the prison ship's engines. It wasn't just the quiet of three creatures who tolerated each other. It was the weight of distrust, thick and stifling, as if the very air conspired to crush him. He needed to break it. "Okay," Kane said, pushing himself upright. "This is awkward. Look, I get it. You're dragons. I'm human. There's probably a whole interstellar rulebook about why we shouldn't get along. But we're stuck here together, so maybe we could—" Dralvir's crystalline eyes narrowed, cutting Kane off mid-sentence. "You talk too much." "Yeah, people say that," Kane admitted, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. "It's a problem. But you know what's a bigger problem? Dying in here." The fire dragon, Harkon, let out a low rumble, his tail scraping against the floor like a blade against stone. "The human thinks he has a solution." "I think I don't want to rot in this cell," Kane countered, his gaze darting between them. "And I think you don't either." Zyrax's serpentine body uncoiled slightly, her scales rippling with a dark, liquid sheen. "You assume much, human. Why should we trust you?" Kane hesitated, then took a deliberate step forward, his boots tapping against the floor. "Because I've been watching. That crystal over there," he gestured to a jagged shard embedded in the wall. "Looks like it was part of an escape attempt. And that scorch mark? Definitely fire-based. I'm guessing you've tried to get out before." Dralvir's crystalline form shifted, refracting the light into fractured rainbows. "We have. And failed." "Exactly," Kane said, pacing now, the energy in his voice rising. "Because you're trying to fight this place with brute force. Dragons are powerful, sure, But the Zephyrites built this prison to counter you. They know your moves. They've adapted. And you think you can succeed where we failed? Harkon's deep voice carried a note of mockery, but his eyes betrayed curiosity. I think, Kane replied, stopping to meet Harkon's gaze, that the Zephyrites don't see me as a threat. That's their first mistake. Zyrax's tail flicked, the sharp crack echoing through the cavernous cell. And what makes you a threat, little human? Kane smirked, though his heart raced. I'm not the strongest, or the fastest, or the most terrifying thing in this room. But humans, we're good at one thing, thinking outside the box. Harkon snorted, a plume of smoke curling from his nostrils. You want to gamble our lives on clever tricks? Not tricks, Kane said firmly. Strategy. Look, you all have incredible abilities, but you're not using them together. That's the Zephyrites' second mistake. They've got you separated even when you're in the same cell. But if we work as a team, we might stand a chance. Dralvir tilted his head, his crystalline features catching the dim light. A team? You speak as though you understand us. Kane inhaled deeply, the metallic tang of the air filling his lungs. I understand survival, and I understand that if we don't try, we're already dead. For a moment, the cell was silent, except for the soft hum of the ship. Kane felt their eyes on him, each gaze a different weight. Dralvir's cold calculation, Zyrax's wary curiosity, Harkon's simmering skepticism. He resisted the urge to wipe his damp palms on his pants. Very well, Dralvir said finally, his voice like the resonant chime of a struck crystal. You have our attention. Speak your plan. Kane exhaled, relief flooding through him. He crouched, running his hand along the cell floor. It was warmer here, as if something pulsed just beneath the surface. First, we test the boundaries. Every system has weaknesses, and we need to find this one's. How does the energy barrier respond to heat? What about shadows? Crystalline disruptions? Zyrax's eyes gleamed, her serpentine body swaying slightly. You mean to poke the beast? Exactly, Kane said. We draw a reaction without revealing our intentions. Once we know how they monitor us, we exploit it. And when they retaliate? Harkon growled, his claws scraping the ground. They will, Kane said, but that's the point. Every response tells us something. Patterns, routines, blind spots, they all have them. Dralvir inclined his head, the faint hum of his crystalline scales filling the air. And what of the Zephyrites themselves? They are methodical. Methodical means predictable, Kane countered. They'll assume we're just another failed attempt waiting to happen. But if we combine your abilities in ways they don't expect, shadow manipulation, crystalline disruption, and fire, then we're not just escaping, we're rewriting the rules. Zyrax slithered closer, her voice a low hiss. You speak boldly, human, but words do not win wars. No, Kane agreed, his voice steady. But they start them. Harkon let out a low, rumbling laugh. You have fire in you, human. I'll give you that. But if this plan fails, your death will be the first. I'll take that risk, Kane said, meeting Harkon's fiery gaze, because it's better than doing nothing. The tension in the room shifted, subtle but palpable. The dragons exchanged glances, their silent communication an unspoken language of trust and hesitation. Kane felt the balance tip, not fully in his favor, but enough. We will test your theory, Dralvir said, his voice solemn, but know this, human. Failure will not be tolerated. Noted, Kane said, his smirk returning. Let's get started. Over the next few hours, they worked in near silence, each testing the cell's defenses in their own way. Dralvir summoned crystalline shards, their vibrations sending ripples through the energy barrier. Zyrax cloaked parts of the room in shifting shadows, observing how the bioluminescent walls reacted. Harkon unleashed controlled bursts of fire, scorching the air and watching for any signs of strain in their prison. Kane observed it all, his mind racing. The floor hummed with energy, the walls pulsed in response to every action, and the air thickened with the scent of singed metal and the faint tang of ozone. He noted every flicker, every shift, every delay. Did you see that? He said, pointing to the barrier as it shimmered faintly after one of Harkon's fire blasts. "It's not just energy, it's layered, different frequencies working together. But they're not perfect. There's a delay when they reset." Zyrax's eyes narrowed, her body coiling like a spring. "And you think we can exploit that?" "I think," Kane said, his voice firm, "we don't have a choice." As they continued their experiments, Kane felt a strange energy growing in the room. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something close, a fragile understanding, a spark of possibility. The dragons still regarded him with caution, but their movements carried less hostility, more purpose. And as the prison ship's hum filled the silence once more, Kane allowed himself a small, fleeting moment of hope. If this works, it's not just escape, it's a beginning. The cell hummed with an undercurrent of tension, a crackling energy that hadn't been there before. Elias Kane crouched by the glowing wall, his fingertips tracing faint patterns etched into the surface. They weren't random. They had a purpose. The grooves were almost imperceptible, like ancient scars, and as he studied them, he couldn't shake the feeling that they told a story, a warning perhaps, but the meaning was locked away in a language he didn't understand. Behind him, the dragons moved like shadows in the dim bioluminescence. Dralvir stood near the far wall, his crystalline form gleaming faintly as his sharp eyes scanned their surroundings. Zyrax coiled lazily along the cell's edge, her liquid movements a deceptive mask for her constant vigilance. Harkon paced, his claws clicking against the metallic floor, his amber eyes flickering like embers threatening to burst into flame. "You're sure they won't notice the barrier weakening?" Zyrax asked, her voice smooth as silk, though doubt laced her tone. "They'll notice," Kane replied, still focused on the grooves in the wall. "The trick is making them think it's just a malfunction." Harkon snorted, a small puff of smoke escaping his nostrils. "And when they investigate?" "Then we're already on to the next step," Kane said, standing and dusting his hands. He met Harkon's fiery gaze with a calm that belied the storm brewing in his mind. "That's the thing about plans. They're only as good as the distractions that keep them alive." Dralvir's voice cut through the air like a sharp chime. "And what is the next step, human? You've been vague." Kane offered a crooked smile, though his mind raced to pull the threads of their plan tighter. "We test their systems further. Zyrax's shadows can disrupt their surveillance. Harkon, you're our misdirection. Make them think the heat signatures are destabilizing the cell. Dralvir, your crystals are the key. They can resonate just enough to short out key frequencies, but not enough to trigger alarms." Dralvir tilted his angular head, his crystalline scales catching the light in fractured rainbows. "And you? What is your role?" "I'm the wild card," Kane said, stepping into the center of the room. "I figure out how to use their arrogance against them." Zyrax's laugh was low, almost a hiss. Bold words for someone so fragile. Kane shrugged, his smirk faint but unyielding. "You'd be surprised what fragile things can do when they've got nothing to lose." As if on cue, the prison ship shuddered, the vibration rippling through the floor like a heartbeat. Kane felt it in his bones, a warning perhaps, or a challenge. The air thickened, carrying the faint metallic tang of stress on the ship's systems. "Let's start small," he said, glancing at the others. "Nothing too obvious, just enough to make them curious." Zyrax melted into the shadows, her serpentine form vanishing into the darkness like smoke dispersing in the wind. Harkon inhaled deeply, his chest expanding before releasing a controlled burst of flame that licked harmlessly against the barrier. The energy field rippled, its steady hum faltering for a fraction of a second before stabilizing again. Dralvir lowered his crystalline horns, releasing a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the air. The sound was subtle at first, like the distant ringing of a wind chime, but it grew, reverberating off the walls until the entire cell seemed alive with shimmering, pulsating light. Kane watched intently, his senses hyper-focused. The barrier responded in kind, its glow flickering erratically as if struggling to adapt. He moved closer, his boots whispering against the floor, and placed his hand against the cool surface of the wall. The faint grooves beneath his fingertips seemed to pulse in time with the barrier's fluctuations. "Perfect," he murmured, his voice low but steady. "Now we wait." The wait didn't last long. Moments later, the faint thrum of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor, accompanied by the sharp click of metal on metal. Kane motioned for the dragons to retreat into their respective corners, their movements silent but deliberate. He pressed himself against the wall near the barrier, his heart pounding in his chest. The Zephyrites entered the cell block, their bioluminescent spots flashing in rhythmic patterns that Kane couldn't decipher. One of them, a tall, wiry figure with a distinct shimmer to its translucent skin, stepped forward, its elongated limbs moving with unsettling fluidity. It paused before the control panel, its tentacles twitching as it examined the barrier. Kane held his breath, the air in his lungs burning as he waited. His palms were slick with sweat, his fingers itching to act, but he forced himself to remain still. Timing was everything. "Barrier fluctuation detected," the Zephyrite said, its translator crackling as it spoke. "Cause unknown. Increased output required." The alien pressed a sequence of glowing symbols on the control panel, and the barrier's hum intensified, the light becoming blindingly bright for a moment before settling. Kane's jaw tightened. "They're adapting faster than I thought." The Zephyrite turned to its companion, its spots flashing in a pattern that seemed almost agitated. "Possible sabotage. Notify Central Command." Kane's stomach dropped. He'd hoped for curiosity, not suspicion. His mind raced, every possible contingency unfolding in rapid succession. Before he could act, the second Zephyrite moved closer to the barrier, its head tilting as if studying the faint crystalline shards Dralvir had left embedded in the surface. It reached out a long, spindly finger. That was when Kane made his move. "Careful!" he called out, stepping into the faint glow of the cell's light. Those shards might be unstable. The Zephyrites snapped their heads toward him, their bioluminescent spots flashing erratically. Kane raised his hands in mock surrender, his expression disarmingly casual. "What are you doing?" the first Zephyrite demanded, its voice harsh and distorted. "Saving your life," Kane said with a wry grin. "Those shards, they're reactive to certain frequencies. You touch the wrong one and boom." He mimed an explosion with his hands. "It's messy." The Zephyrites exchanged glances, their tentacles writhing in what Kane hoped was uncertainty. He kept his expression neutral, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "And how would you know this, human?" the second Zephyrite asked, its voice dripping with suspicion. Kane shrugged. "Call it a hunch. But hey, if you want to risk it..." He gestured to the shards with a flick of his wrist. "Be my guest." The first Zephyrite hesitated, its elongated fingers twitching before pulling back. It turned to its companion, its spots flashing in a sequence too fast for Kane to follow. Then, without another word, they exited the cell block, their movements hurried and tense. Kane exhaled sharply, his body sagging against the wall. He turned to the dragons, their eyes gleaming with a mixture of surprise and grudging respect. "Well," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that buys us some time." Harkon let out a low chuckle, the sound like the rumble of distant thunder. "You may not be as useless as you look, human." "High praise," Kane muttered, wiping his damp palms on his pants. But his mind was already elsewhere, turning over the next step of their plan. The Zephyrites would be back, and next time, they wouldn't just be curious. He glanced at the wall again, his gaze lingering on the faint grooves that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. They weren't just scars. They were something more, something he couldn't quite grasp yet. And they were a key he desperately needed to understand. The Zephyrites were not predictable creatures. They were calculating, meticulous in their actions, yet prone to moments of chilling creativity. Kane leaned against the cool wall, his gaze fixed on the faint grooves carved into the surface, still pulsing with faint energy. The movements of the Zephyrite guards lingered in his mind like a puzzle missing its final piece. They'd left quickly, but not without suspicion. Something told him they'd return sooner rather than later, and not alone. The dragons remained quiet. Zyrax coiled near the cell's far corner, her liquid scales shifting with an almost hypnotic rhythm. Dralvir stood rigid, his crystalline form reflecting the ambient glow like fractured starlight. Harkon paced slowly, his claws leaving faint trails in the floor as the faint scent of smoke curled around him. Their energy was subdued, but tension buzzed beneath the surface. An invisible string pulled taut and waiting to snap. Kane broke the silence. They'll come back, this time, with reinforcements. Harkon's growl was low, almost a vibration. And what will your cleverness do then, human? Kane's lips twitched into a faint smile, though his mind churned. Reinforcements mean one thing: chaos. The more pieces they put in play, the more chances we have to break them apart. You speak as though their numbers are an advantage to us, Dralvir said, his voice resonant and sharp. They are not. They are if they think they're in control, Kane replied, his voice steady. He turned to Zyrax, who watched him with narrowed eyes. How long can your shadows last if you're not directly controlling them? Zyrax tilted her head, her forked tongue flicking briefly. A few seconds, no more. The energy required is considerable. Kane nodded, filing the information away. We don't need much time, just enough to make them doubt what they're seeing. Harkon stopped pacing, his fiery eyes locking onto Kane. And when they don't doubt, when they strike, then we make them strike where we want them to, Kane said. Dralvir, those crystals you embedded, can they resonate at a frequency strong enough to disrupt their weapons? For a short time, Dralvir replied, his crystalline form shifting slightly. But the disruption will draw attention. Good, Kane said, his grin faint but determined. We want their attention. Zyrax hissed softly, her dark body uncoiling as she slithered closer. You gamble with our lives, human. If this fails, there will be no second chance. Kane met her gaze, unflinching. If we don't gamble, there's no chance at all. The ship trembled slightly beneath their feet, the hum of its engines deepening. Kane felt the shift like a predator sensing its prey's approach. The guards were coming. He could almost hear the distant cadence of their steps, sharp and deliberate, like the ticking of a countdown. Positions, Kane said quietly. The dragons didn't argue. Harkon moved to the barrier, his massive frame radiating barely restrained power. Dralvir crouched low, his crystalline scales refracting faint rainbows across the cell. Zyrax melted into the shadows, her form dissolving into the darkness like smoke curling into the night. Kane positioned himself near the grooves in the wall. They pulsed faintly, as if responding to his presence. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were alive, an ancient mechanism waiting to be understood. But now wasn't the time for curiosity. Now was the time for survival. The first guard arrived, its bioluminescent spots flashing in sharp bursts as it entered the cell block. Behind it, two more followed, their movements fluid and unnervingly synchronized. Kane's heart quickened as he counted their steps, their positions. 3 now. More coming. Stay calm. The lead guard stepped to the control panel, its tentacles twitching as it input a sequence. The barrier's glow intensified, the hum growing louder until it vibrated in Kane's bones. Harkon let out a low growl, his muscles coiled like a spring. Hold, Kane murmured, just loud enough for the dragons to hear. The guards began to spread out, their translucent forms casting strange, warping shadows across the cell. One moved closer to the crystalline shards embedded in the wall, its long, spindly fingers reaching out cautiously. Kane moved. Careful, he called out, his voice cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. The guards froze, their spots flashing erratically. Kane stepped forward, his hands raised. You touch that, and it might destabilize the whole cell. The lead guard turned its glowing eyes toward him, its translator crackling. Explain. Kane's mind raced. Those crystals? They're reactive to heat, energy, pretty much anything. You touch them, they'll resonate, and this whole place goes boom. The guards exchanged quick flashes of light, their silent communication too fast for Kane to follow. He forced himself to remain calm, his breathing steady despite the tension clawing at his chest. "We will neutralize the threat," the lead guard said finally, its voice cold and mechanical. "Yeah, good luck with that," Kane muttered under his breath. He glanced at Dralvir, who gave the faintest nod. The moment the guard's fingers brushed the crystal, Dralvir activated the resonance. A low, vibrating hum filled the air, building rapidly into a sharp, piercing tone. The guards recoiled, their bioluminescent spots flickering erratically as the sound disrupted their systems. "Now!" Kane shouted. Harkon surged forward, unleashing a torrent of fire that blasted against the barrier. The energy field rippled violently, its hum faltering as the heat overloaded its circuits. Zyrax's shadows exploded outward, engulfing the cell in inky darkness that seemed to writhe and twist like living smoke. Kane moved with purpose, his senses heightened. He ducked low, sliding toward the control panel as chaos erupted around him. The Zephyrites were disoriented, their movements frantic as they tried to regain control. Kane's fingers flew across the glowing symbols, his eyes scanning for patterns. "There," he muttered, finding the override sequence. He input the command, and the barrier flickered once, twice, then collapsed with a sharp hiss. "Go!" Kane shouted, motioning to the dragons. Harkon charged first, his massive frame barreling through the opening like a battering ram. Dralvir followed, his crystalline form shimmering as he unleashed a barrage of razor-sharp shards that ricocheted through the cell block. Zyrax slithered silently, her shadows weaving a cloak of confusion around their movements. Kane brought up the rear, his pulse pounding as alarms blared throughout the ship. The air was thick with the acrid scent of scorched metal and the sharp tang of ozone. The flickering bioluminescent lights cast eerie, shifting patterns across the walls, making the entire corridor feel alive. They didn't stop. They couldn't. The sounds of pursuit were growing louder, the rhythmic clicks of Zephyrite footsteps echoing through the corridors. But Kane's mind was already racing ahead, calculating their next move. They'd broken free of the cell, but escaping the ship was a different challenge entirely. As they turned a corner, the corridor opened into a larger chamber, its walls lined with strange, pulsating devices. Kane's eyes caught on something, a faintly glowing panel embedded in the far wall, its grooves identical to the ones in the cell. "What is that?" Harkon growled, his voice rough. "Maybe our way out," Kane said, moving toward it. The grooves pulsed faintly, almost as if recognizing his touch. Behind them, the sound of approaching guards grew louder, more urgent. Kane's jaw tightened as he studied the panel. Whatever this is, it has to matter. He pressed his hand against the grooves, and the ship shuddered violently. The lights dimmed, and for a brief, terrifying moment, the hum of the ship's systems faltered. Then a low, guttural voice echoed through the chamber, a sound that made Kane's blood run cold. It wasn't Zephyrite. It was older, deeper, and it was awake. The guttural voice reverberated through the chamber like the groan of a shifting planet. It wasn't a sound that belonged to the living. It carried the weight of ancient stone grinding against itself, a low, resonant force that pressed against Kane's chest and rattled his ribs. The dragons froze, their predatory grace momentarily replaced by raw, unguarded fear. "What did you touch, human?" Harkon growled, his fiery eyes darting to the glowing panel under Kane's hand. "I think it touched me," Kane replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The grooves beneath his palm seemed to pulse with life, each ridge burning faintly, sending a tingling warmth through his arm. It wasn't pain, not yet, but it felt like standing too close to a roaring fire. Dangerous, but oddly captivating. The ship shuddered again, this time more violently. Lights flickered, plunging the corridor into intermittent darkness. The bioluminescent patterns on the walls dimmed, replaced by erratic flashes that danced like lightning trapped in a bottle. The acrid smell of overheating circuits mixed with the faint, sulfurous tang of something older and far less mechanical. Dralvir moved first, his crystalline form gleaming as he stepped toward Kane. "That voice, it is not Zephyrite." No kidding, Kane muttered, his gaze fixed on the glowing panel. The grooves seemed deeper now, their pulsing rhythm growing stronger, almost hypnotic. This whole place feels wrong. Zyrax materialized from the shadows, her serpentine body undulating like a whisper of smoke. "That is not the prison," she hissed, her voice lower than usual. "It is the prison's keeper." Kane's breath caught. "Keeper? What the hell is a—" The voice boomed again, cutting him off. This time it carried a distinct rhythm, a language older than words but no less commanding. Kane didn't understand it, but he felt it, the meaning pressing into his skull like a relentless tide. "Release," it seemed to demand. "Awaken. Consume." The grooves beneath Kane's palm grew hotter, forcing him to pull back. The moment he broke contact, the pulsing stopped, replaced by a deep, ominous hum. A low vibration traveled through the floor, rattling his boots and sending dust cascading from the ceiling. Something massive was stirring, shifting beneath the surface of the ship. "We need to move," Dralvir said sharply, his crystalline form vibrating with a frequency that made Kane's teeth ache. "Now." "Not yet," Kane replied, his gaze darting back to the panel. "This thing, whatever it is, wasn't built by the Zephyrites, was it?" "No," Zyrax hissed, her forked tongue flicking nervously. "It predates them. The Zephyrites are fools. They thought they could control it." Kane's pulse quickened. Then why build a prison on top of it? What were they trying to keep locked away? Harkon let out a guttural snarl. "Not locked away. Used. The Zephyrites are scavengers. Parasites. They think everything can be bent to their will." The ship groaned, the sound deeper this time, more resonant. The floor beneath them tilted slightly, as if the massive structure were shifting under its own weight. Kane stumbled, his hand shooting out to steady himself against the wall. The glowing grooves flared briefly, then dimmed, leaving behind faint scorch marks. "They woke something up," he said, his voice barely audible over the rising hum. "And it's not happy." A sharp, metallic screech echoed from the corridor behind them. Kane turned just in time to see a wave of Zephyrite guards rushing toward them, their bioluminescent spots flashing in rapid, chaotic patterns. Their fluid movements were sharper now, less controlled, as if even they were affected by whatever was happening. "Hold them off!" Kane shouted, already moving toward the nearest console. The glowing panel wasn't their escape route, but it might hold answers, or at least a way to buy time. Harkon surged forward, his massive frame filling the corridor as he unleashed a torrent of fire. The flames roared, illuminating the space in brilliant orange and gold, casting monstrous shadows against the walls. The heat was overwhelming, the air thick with the acrid tang of burning metal and flesh. The guards faltered but didn't stop, their forms darting through the inferno with an unsettling, inhuman resilience. Dralvir followed, his crystalline shards tearing through the air like deadly fragments of glass. Each strike was precise, the shards embedding themselves in the guards with a sickening crunch. The vibrations from his attacks resonated through the corridor, disrupting the guards' movements and leaving a trail of shattered bodies in his wake. Zyrax disappeared into the shadows, her presence marked only by the faint shimmer of her scales as she moved. She struck with surgical precision, her elongated body wrapping around a guard and crushing it with terrifying ease. The sound of cracking exoskeletons mixed with the hissing of her venom, which corroded armor and flesh alike. Kane worked feverishly at the console, his fingers flying over the glowing symbols. The grooves beneath his touch pulsed faintly, responding to his movements as though the ancient system recognized him, or at least tolerated him. Data scrolled across the screen, alien symbols and patterns he couldn't fully decipher, but understood instinctively. "It's alive," he muttered, his voice laced with awe and dread. "The ship. It's not just a ship, it's symbiotic." "Less talking, more doing," Harkon roared, his fiery attacks slowing as exhaustion began to set in. The air around him shimmered with heat, the walls scorched black from the intensity of his flames. "I'm trying," Kane snapped, his frustration mounting. The symbols blurred, then reformed, as if the system were testing him, pushing him to prove his worth. He pressed another sequence, and the grooves flared brightly, the light spreading outward in jagged lines that pulsed through the walls like veins. The ship shuddered violently, throwing Kane off balance. He caught himself against the console, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The ancient voice returned, louder this time, its resonance shaking the very air around them. Release, awaken, consume. Kane's blood ran cold as the meaning struck him. It's not the keeper, it's the prisoner. The dragons paused, their gazes snapping to him. Even the Zephyrite guards hesitated, their bioluminescent spots dimming as if they, too, felt the gravity of those words. "What do you mean?" Dralvir demanded, his voice sharp. "This isn't a prison for us," Kane said, his voice rising. "It's a prison for something else, something they tried to control." A deep, guttural roar erupted from somewhere below, shaking the entire structure. The floor buckled, sending guards and debris tumbling. A jagged crack split the corridor, glowing with an intense, otherworldly light that spilled upward like molten lava. Zyrax hissed, her serpentine body retreating from the fissure. "What is that?" Kane's jaw tightened. "Our way out, or our end." The light intensified, filling the chamber with a searing brilliance that burned away the shadows. Kane shielded his eyes, his mind racing. The grooves on the walls pulsed in unison, their rhythm matching the ancient voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Release," it demanded one final time, the words slamming into Kane's chest like a physical force. He turned to the dragons, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We have to move," he said. "Whatever's down there, it's not staying put." The roar came again, louder, closer. The fissure widened, and from its depths emerged a shape, massive, formless, and alive with an energy that defied comprehension. And it was waking up. The fissure widened with a deafening crack, spilling light so intense that the air shimmered as if aflame. The shape emerging from the depths was a monstrosity of writhing tendrils, its surface pulsating with an otherworldly luminescence. It defied logic, its form shifting in ways that hurt to look at, as though it were not bound by the rules of physical space. Each movement radiated an overwhelming sense of malice, primal and ancient, as though the very concept of freedom had ignited its wrath. Kane stumbled back, his instincts screaming to run even as his mind locked onto the possibilities. This thing wasn't just alive. It was intelligence, hunger, and vengeance, wrapped into a single overwhelming presence. The roar it unleashed shook the ship, the sound bypassing his ears and clawing directly at his nerves. He felt it in his bones, his marrow trembling under the weight of the noise. "Move!" he shouted, his voice raw, his body snapping into action. Harkon didn't need encouragement. With a furious bellow, the dragon surged forward, interposing his massive bulk between the group and the monstrosity. Flames erupted from his jaws, scorching the air in a blinding torrent of heat and light. The flames licked at the creature's tendrils, but instead of retreating, the thing absorbed the fire, its surface rippling with an unnatural glow that seemed to mock Harkon's effort. "It feeds on energy," Dralvir shouted, his crystalline body vibrating with urgency. "You're making it stronger," Harkon snarled but held his ground, his massive claws digging into the floor. "Then what will stop it, genius?" "Not fire," Kane said, his mind racing, "and not brute force. We need to—" A tendril lashed out, impossibly fast, striking the wall beside Kane. The impact sent shards of metal flying, the sharp tang of heated alloys mixing with the acrid stench of burnt circuitry. Sparks rained down, and Kane dove aside, narrowly avoiding the tendril as it writhed with a disturbing sentience, probing the air like a predator testing the wind. "Split up!" he barked, rolling to his feet. "Don't let it focus on one target." Zyrax melted into the shadows without a word, her serpentine form vanishing into the gloom like a whisper. Dralvir took a calculated step back, his crystalline shards spinning into the air around him in a protective spiral. Harkon roared again, but this time he retreated, his fiery attacks replaced by defensive positioning. Kane sprinted toward the glowing panel he'd activated earlier. It had responded to him, pulsed under his hand as if alive. If this thing, the prisoner, the monstrosity, had been locked away, then the panel must be connected to whatever mechanism had held it. The grooves flared as he approached, their rhythmic pulsing matching the creature's movements. Kane placed his hand on the panel, and a searing heat shot through his palm, making him grit his teeth. The grooves came alive, the symbols shifting into new configurations faster than he could process. It wasn't just a control system, it was a conversation. "Talk to me," Kane muttered under his breath, his mind racing. He pressed sequences, testing the response. Each input seemed to resonate with the grooves, but none of them stopped the creature's advance. Instead, the fissure continued to expand, more tendrils spilling into the chamber, their movements chaotic yet terrifyingly deliberate. Behind him, a sharp, pained hiss made him whip around. Zyrax reappeared, her sleek body coiled tightly as a tendril wrapped around her midsection. The creature lifted her effortlessly, her scales rippling as she twisted in its grip, but its strength was overwhelming. Her hisses turned to choked growls as the tendril tightened, her form struggling against the unrelenting pressure. "Let her go!" Kane roared, slamming his fist against the panel. He had no idea what he'd pressed, but the grooves flared brilliantly, the light shooting out in jagged patterns that lanced toward the tendril holding Zyrax. The creature recoiled, its appendage releasing her as the energy struck. Zyrax dropped to the floor, landing heavily, but alive. "Whatever you did," Harkon growled, his voice a rumble of barely contained fury, "do it again!" Kane didn't hesitate, his fingers flying over the glowing symbols. The grooves responded, their patterns aligning into something more coherent. A low mechanical hum filled the chamber, rising steadily in pitch until it became almost unbearable. The ship shuddered again, and this time it wasn't just the fissure. The walls pulsed, the bioluminescent patterns dimming as though the ship itself were straining under the effort. The creature roared again, its voice layered with something new. Pain. It lashed out, its tendrils striking wildly, smashing into walls and consoles with devastating force. Sparks and debris rained down, the air thick with the acrid tang of burning wires and the metallic bite of fractured steel. "It's reacting!" Dralvir called out, his crystalline form glowing faintly as he hurled shards toward the creature. They struck true, embedding in its shifting mass, but the monstrosity absorbed them, its surface rippling with a malevolent energy. "Keep it focused." "That's easy for you to say," Harkon snapped, ducking under a sweeping tendril and countering with a swipe of his claws. The impact sent tremors through the floor, but the creature barely flinched. Kane pressed another sequence, his brow furrowed in concentration. The grooves on the panel shifted again, this time revealing a new configuration, a set of overlapping circles, their centers glowing faintly. He hesitated for only a moment before pressing his hand against the largest circle. The panel flared, and a deep rumble echoed through the chamber. The fissure's expansion slowed, its edges stabilizing as if held in place by an invisible force. The creature roared in defiance, its tendrils thrashing more violently, but it didn't advance. "It's working!" Kane shouted, though his voice was hoarse from the strain. "We're holding it back." "For how long?" Zyrax rasped, her voice unsteady but still sharp. She rose to her full height, her scales shimmering faintly despite the dim light. "This thing won't stay contained forever." "We don't need forever," Kane said, his voice grim. "Just long enough to get off this ship." The fissure pulsed again, the light within it dimming briefly, before surging back stronger than before. The creature roared, and this time its tendrils coiled together, forming a massive appendage that slammed into the floor with enough force to send everyone sprawling. Kane hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. The panel flickered above him, its light dimming as if in protest. He scrambled to his feet, his vision blurred, his ears ringing from the deafening crash. "We're out of time!" Harkon bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. Kane nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then we make time." He turned back to the panel, his mind racing. The grooves flared one last time, their rhythm erratic, as though the ancient mechanism were struggling to maintain control. Kane placed both hands on the panel, ignoring the searing heat that shot through his arms, and pressed the final sequence. The fissure erupted with light, its edges collapsing inward. The creature let out a final deafening roar as the chamber filled with a blinding brilliance that consumed everything. And then, silence. The silence after the explosion of light was oppressive, dense, as if the air itself mourned the loss of sound. Kane blinked, his vision a kaleidoscope of afterimages that danced and twisted in the corners of his mind. His body ached, each movement a reminder of the violent tremor that had thrown him against the unforgiving floor. Around him, the chamber seemed to hold its breath, the eerie glow of the fissure now reduced to faint, flickering embers. "Report!" Kane rasped, his throat raw from shouting. "I live," Dralvir replied, his voice a resonant chime. His crystalline form was dulled, fractures running across his scales like the scars of a shattered mirror. He stood stiffly, his stance unyielding despite the visible strain. Zyrax emerged from the shadows, her movements slower than before, the sleek ripples of her scales now marred by dull patches where the creature's tendrils had grazed her. "It retreats," she said, her voice low and sharp. "For now." Harkon let out a pained snarl as he pushed himself upright. Smoke rose faintly from his charred wings, and his claws scraped the floor as he steadied himself. "And when it returns," he growled, his fiery eyes burning with frustration. "What then?" Kane staggered to his feet, gripping the edge of the console for balance. The grooves beneath his hand were dark now, their once vibrant glow extinguished. The mechanism had worked, but only partially. The fissure had stopped expanding, but the creature still lingered, its malevolent presence palpable even in its diminished state. "We finished the job," Kane said, his voice steadier than he felt. He turned to the dragons, his gaze sweeping over their battered forms. "This thing isn't invincible. We just need to think smarter." "And fast," Zyrax interjected, her forked tongue flicking. "Its strength grows each moment it lingers." Kane nodded, his mind racing. He replayed the events leading to the fissure's partial collapse, dissecting each detail for clues. The panel had responded to his touch, its sequences attuned to his input. That connection wasn't random, it was a key. But the creature's resilience meant they needed more than brute force. They needed strategy. He glanced at the fissure, its jagged edges pulsing faintly like a wound struggling to heal. Then he looked at the dragons, their unique abilities now essential to his hastily forming plan. "All right," he began, his voice firm. "Here's how we take it down." Dralvir shifted, his crystalline body emitting a faint hum. "You have a plan already?" "I'm improvising," Kane admitted, a wry smile flickering across his face. "But it's better than waiting to die." He stepped to the console, his fingers brushing over the dark grooves. "This panel controls more than just the fissure," he explained. "It's part of the ship's ancient systems. Systems the Zephyrites clearly don't understand. If we can reactivate it, we can turn this thing against the creature." Zyrax tilted her head, her slitted eyes narrowing. "Turn the prison into a weapon?" "Exactly," Kane said, his mind already racing ahead. "But it's not enough to trap it. We need to sever its connection to the fissure. Dralvir, your crystals, can they amplify resonance to disrupt the creature's core?" Dralvir's fractured form glowed faintly as he considered. "It is possible, but the precision required is delicate." "Good," Kane said. "Zyrax, your shadows, can they shield us from its tendrils long enough to give Dralvir the time he needs?" Zyrax hissed softly, her tongue flicking in thought. "It will cost me much energy, but it can be done." "And Harkon," Kane said, turning to the fire dragon, "I need you to create controlled blasts. No direct hits, just enough to force it to focus on you." Harkon snorted, a puff of smoke curling from his nostrils. "You want me to play bait?" "I want you to give us a fighting chance," Kane replied, meeting Harkon's gaze without flinching. "Can you do it?" The fire dragon growled, but after a moment he nodded. "Fine. But if this fails—" "It won't," Kane cut in, "because we don't have the luxury of failure." The dragons exchanged glances, their silent agreement sealed in the tense air. Kane turned back to the console, his fingers tracing the grooves as he searched for the spark of life within the dormant system. He closed his eyes, focusing on the faint rhythm he'd felt before, the almost sentient pulse of the ancient mechanism. "Come on," he muttered under his breath. "Talk to me." The grooves flared faintly, a flicker of light pulsing under his fingertips. He pressed the sequences again, his movements more deliberate now. The light grew brighter, the grooves aligning into patterns that seemed to hum with recognition. "Got it," he said, his voice tinged with relief. "The system's responding." Behind him the fissure shuddered, its edges writhing as the creature reacted to the activation. Tendrils lashed out, their movements erratic but deadly, smashing into walls and consoles with bone-shaking force. "Positions!" Kane shouted, his hands flying over the console. Zyrax vanished into the shadows, her form melding with the darkness as she cloaked the group in a veil of shifting, impenetrable black. Dralvir moved to the fissure's edge, his crystalline shards spinning into the air, each one glowing with a faint, resonant light. Harkon stood his ground, his fiery aura blazing as he released controlled bursts of flame, each one strategically placed to draw the creature's ire. The tendrils thrashed, slamming into the walls with earth-shaking force, but Zyrax's shadows held firm, the inky darkness absorbing the impacts. Dralvir's shards vibrated with increasing intensity, their resonance growing sharper, more focused. The sound cut through the air like a high-pitched melody, piercing and relentless. Kane worked feverishly at the console, the grooves beneath his fingers glowing brighter with each input. The ship's systems hummed in response, their ancient mechanisms awakening under his touch. The air grew thick with energy, the faint smell of ozone mingling with the acrid tang of burning metal. "Hold it steady!" he called out, his voice strained. Harkon roared, his flames arcing through the chamber in a dazzling display of controlled chaos. The creature recoiled, its tendrils flinching away from the heat, its movements growing more erratic. "Now, Dralvir!" Kane shouted. The crystalline dragon unleashed his shards, each one spinning into the fissure with precision. The resonance they emitted grew into a deafening crescendo, the sound vibrating through the chamber like 1,000 chimes struck in unison. The fissure's pulsing light dimmed, its edges quivering as though struggling to maintain its form. "It's working!" Zyrax hissed, her voice laced with exhaustion. Her shadows wavered, their edges fraying, but she held them steady, her body coiled tightly as she poured every ounce of energy into the shield. Kane pressed the final sequence, the grooves beneath his hands flaring with blinding light. The ship shuddered violently, its systems surging to life as the fissure began to collapse. The creature roared, its voice a mix of rage and desperation, its tendrils thrashing wildly as it fought against the encroaching energy. "Finish it!" Kane bellowed. With a final thunderous roar, Harkon unleashed a torrent of fire, the flames arcing toward the fissure in a brilliant explosion of heat and light. Dralvir's resonance shattered through the chamber, the sound splitting the air like a thunderclap. The fissure imploded, its light vanishing in an instant, leaving behind only silence. The creature was gone. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace, but the kind that lingered in the wake of devastation, heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. Kane's ears rang, a high-pitched whine that refused to dissipate. The chamber was shrouded in darkness now, the bioluminescent patterns on the walls extinguished, as if even the ship needed to catch its breath. The fissure, once a pulsing, chaotic tear in reality, was gone. All that remained was a jagged scar on the floor, its edges faintly glowing like embers smoldering after a dying fire. Kane leaned against the console, his chest heaving as he fought to steady his breathing. His fingers trembled, raw and burned from the intensity of the ancient mechanism's energy. His body ached, his muscles screaming from exertion, but the knowledge that they'd succeeded, that the creature was gone, gave him enough strength to stand. "Is it over?" Zyrax's voice was barely more than a whisper, her serpentine body emerging from the tattered remnants of her shadow cloak. Her scales, dulled and battered, shimmered faintly as she coiled herself protectively near the fissure's edge. "For now," Kane replied, his voice low but firm. His gaze didn't waver from the scar on the floor, as if he expected the creature to claw its way back at any moment. Harkon lumbered forward, his massive frame casting long shadows in the dim light. Smoke curled lazily from his nostrils, his fiery aura diminished but still present. "You sound unsure, human." Kane turned to him, meeting the dragon's fiery gaze with his own steady determination. "It's not about being sure. It's about being prepared." Dralvir approached slowly, his crystalline form fractured and dim yet unbowed. His voice rang out, sharp and deliberate. "What was it? That thing? It was not of this world?" "It wasn't just a thing," Kane said, his words laced with exhaustion. "It was an idea, a weapon, a monster. The Zephyrites woke it up thinking they could use it. They were wrong. And yet," Zirax hissed softly, her tongue flicking out, "it is humanity that stopped it." Kane let out a short, humorless laugh, his hand wiping at the sweat streaking his face. "Yeah, well, we have a habit of cleaning up other people's messes, and sometimes making them." The ship groaned, a deep metallic sigh that echoed through the chamber. It was a sound of strain, as if the structure itself was struggling to hold together after what it had endured. The dragons exchanged uneasy glances, their forms visibly tense. "We need to move," Kane said, his tone shifting. "The ship's systems are failing. If we don't get off this thing now, we go down with it." "And how exactly do we do that?" Harkon growled, his claws flexing against the floor. "The Zephyrites will have reinforced their hold on the landing bays by now." "Then we take the unexpected route," Kane replied, already moving toward the panel. His fingers flew over the grooves, their faint glow returning under his touch. The ship's ancient systems hummed in response, the vibrations faint but growing stronger. Zirax tilted her head, her voice sharp with curiosity. "You're gambling again." Kane glanced at her, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Gambling's the only thing that's worked so far." The console flared brighter, illuminating new pathways on the walls, glowing symbols that twisted and pulsed like veins feeding life back into the ship. Kane followed the patterns with his eyes, his mind piecing together the connections as if solving a puzzle. His breath hitched as he realized what the system was showing him. "There's another way out," he said, turning to the dragons. "An escape pod, older tech, part of the original ship before the Zephyrites retrofitted it. They wouldn't even know it exists." "Convenient," Harkon muttered, though his tone carried a grudging respect. "Convenient would have been not getting thrown in this cell in the first place," Kane shot back. "Let's go." The path the console revealed was hidden deep within the ship's structure, a series of winding corridors and forgotten passageways that seemed untouched for centuries. The air was different here, thicker, colder, with a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of Kane's throat. The walls were smoother, devoid of the bioluminescent patterns that had defined the rest of the ship. It felt ancient, like stepping into a relic that time itself had abandoned. The dragons moved silently behind him, their injuries evident but their resolve unbroken. Dralvir's crystalline body refracted faint light in jagged shards, his movements deliberate and steady. Zirax slithered through the shadows, her sleek form blending with the dim surroundings. Harkon's heavy footsteps echoed softly, his fiery presence subdued, but ever watchful. "This ship," Kane murmured as they moved, his eyes scanning the walls. "It wasn't just a prison. It was something else, something older." "A vault," Dralvir said, his voice resonating with quiet certainty. "A tomb for what they could not destroy. Until the Zephyrites got greedy," Zirax added, her tone laced with disdain. Kane nodded grimly. "Greed's a universal constant. Doesn't matter what species you are." They reached the end of the passage, where a massive hatch loomed before them. Its surface was marked with intricate carvings, symbols that pulsed faintly as if recognizing their presence. Kane placed his hand against the center, and the grooves flared with light, the hatch groaning as it began to open. Beyond the hatch lay a small chamber, its walls lined with rows of ancient dormant technology. At its center sat the escape pod, a sleek oblong structure that hummed faintly with latent power. The air inside the chamber was crisp, untouched, carrying a faint ozone-like charge that prickled Kane's skin. "This is it," he said, stepping inside. He turned to the dragons, his gaze steady. "We're getting out of here." The dragons moved into the chamber, their forms towering yet strangely reverent in the presence of the ancient escape pod. Dralvir ran a crystalline claw along the edge of the pod, his touch deliberate and curious. "And what of the Zephyrites?" Harkon asked, his fiery eyes narrowing. "They won't stop hunting us." Kane smirked, his hand brushing over the pod's controls. "Let them try. We just took down their biggest weapon. That's bound to make them think twice." "And if it doesn't?" Zirax pressed, her voice sharp but calm. "Then we remind them why you don't mess with humans," Kane said, his tone light but carrying an edge of steel. He turned to the controls, his fingers flying over the symbols. The pod hummed to life, its systems responding instantly to his touch. The chamber shuddered as the escape pod detached, the walls trembling as the ancient technology roared back to life. Kane strapped himself into the pilot's seat, the dragons settling into the pod's reinforced compartments. The vibrations grew stronger, the hum rising into a deafening crescendo as the pod launched, blasting free from the ship and into the void of space. Through the viewport, Kane watched as the prison ship collapsed in on itself, its ancient structure crumbling under the strain. The light from the fissure dimmed, swallowed by the darkness, until nothing remained but silence. Kane exhaled, a long, steady breath that carried the weight of everything they'd survived. He leaned back in his seat, his gaze fixed on the endless expanse of stars stretching before them. "Human," Dralvir said, his voice quiet but resonant. "You were not what we expected." Kane glanced at him, a faint grin tugging at his lips. "Yeah, that happens a lot." Zirax coiled in her compartment, her slitted eyes gleaming. "Perhaps humanity is more dangerous than we believed." Kane chuckled softly, his gaze drifting back to the stars. "We're not the strongest, or the fastest, or the smartest, but when the chips are down, we figure it out. That's what makes us dangerous." Harkon snorted, his fiery aura flickering faintly. "And reckless." "Reckless works," Kane said, his smirk widening. "They threw me in that cell thinking I was prey. They forgot one thing." "And what is that?" Zirax asked. Kane's voice was steady, his tone sharp. "Humans are the real monsters." The pod soared into the void, leaving the wreckage of the prison ship far behind, its passengers carrying the weight of a battle won and a war just beginning.